And the really big question right now is, will India make it? Right? Will India make it? Where? Will India make it to what? And that's I'm coming to. But the short thing is, will we be a country which will be seen as developed, will be developed, and our income levels will be within the high income group? Because that is the ultimate goal of any nation, that we should not have poverty, we should not have people living in conditions that are below the dignity level of human beings. So we really need to elevate and uplift the whole population, and the way to do it is to ensure that the income level goes up. But the question is, will India make it? But in the first part, let me begin with not talking about India, but talking about generally, what does it take, or is it guaranteed that so this is the question that I'll be essentially asking throughout this throughout this talk, that will India become rich? And then the corollary of it, and in some sense, it's not actually a corollary, it's the overarching question that we have, is, do all countries become rich? Is growth guaranteed? Do countries always grow, right? I mean, that's the question that we wanted to ask. And by the way, this is a question that is at the heart of economics, right? I mean, it goes back a long way, even if you think about Adam Smith, when he writes The Wealth of a Nation, he is essentially asking the same question, that what does it take for a nation to become wealthy, right? And more concretely, in 1970s, Bob Lucas, one of the Nobel laureates, he posed this question, that why are some countries rich and some countries poor? What do we know about it? How do we go about answering those questions and ensuring that countries become rich? So that's at the heart of it, all of this discussion, right? So let me start with a graph that I like showing to a lot of people. And it sometimes surprises people. But the matter of fact is, growth is a very, very, very recent phenomenon in the history of humanity. As you can see, for a really, really, really large period of our history, we did not really grow. I mean, we can think about starting of agriculture and the period after that. That means, what does it mean not to grow? That means generations after generations after generations were living in the same conditions, right? In the same way. So if you were in a period born here or something like that, your grandparents would have seen the same world. Yeah, and maybe even their grandparents would have seen practically the same world. Things started changing around 1700s, right? The Industrial Revolution. And then only essentially post-World War II do we see the world really taking off. There's a lot of growth that, substantial amount of growth that has happened slightly before that, but the most high growth period as far as the world is concerned is post-World War II, right? So it is something that we really, really cannot take for granted, that it will happen naturally, it will happen for sure, and it has happened forever. It has not, right? So let's talk about more concrete examples. That is it necessary that all countries will become rich? Think about this. The year is 1914. The first wave of globalization was before this period, right? What was 1914? By the way, why is it known in the history? It's a very important year in the history. Maybe you can.
The World War, sir.
First World
War One, right? Exactly. So World War One, right? So, but also significantly, this was the period before that was the first wave of globalization, right? And you can think about ways where the world was coming together, right? Steam engine has changed telegram, steam engine, transportation has really changed how the world could reach to the other, I mean, people could reach to the other end of the world. And if you read Keynes, he says that, you know, it's a very exciting time because I am sitting in London and sipping in tea from Darjeeling and biscuits from Belgium and wearing and crockery from China and so on and so forth, right? So everything is available at that point in London. Of course, UK is the richest country at that point of time, vast empire under its rule. So London certainly is the center of the world at that point of time. And Harrods is the shop to be going to, shop for all of this, right? And not only, by the way, you didn't have to actually go to the shop. You could telephone them, and they would deliver you, right? I mean, so today, of course, when Zomato's IPO is, you know, making news, this kind of delivery service was there at that point of time. So Harrods is an institution. Now Harrods decides to open its first overseas store, right? It's been there for some time now, maybe 30, 40 years, 1890 or so, it went public. Then 1914 was the year when it decided that it will open its first overseas stores, right? Harrods of London is still an icon, though it's very different today. Actually not owned by a British, it's owned by Qatar, right? But 1914 was when it started its first overseas store. Can you guess where? Go ahead. You can write in comments, and Vishwanath, if you can read out the comments because I can't see the comments, and or you can just open your mic and talk. Say.
Sir, Harrods opened in Argentina, their first commercial store.
Exactly right. So, well, I did not expect the first answer to be right, but I'm glad that you got it right. So Argentina, right? Buenos Aires, Argentina. Why? Of all places, remember, as I said, British Empire is, you know, all of Asia, Africa. It has influence in Europe, of course, and Europe is rich, many parts of Europe and so on. But why? And I've already given you a hint.
So the inflow of money, the highest, I mean, the country that could give in the revenue, considering it's Harrods and the brand is really well established.
Maybe you can identify yourself so that, you know, your batchmates will also get to know. I'll also get to know. Can you identify yourself?
So this is Jigisha.
Jigisha, yeah. Of course, I mean, inflow matters. So, you know, the question is, why not Paris, right? Why not Istanbul for that matter, or Calcutta for that matter, or something, right? Because Argentina at that point of time is one of the richest countries in the world. It is the 5th richest country in the world, right? Buenos Aires is a very exciting place. Almost half of the population at that point of time is like not born in Buenos Aires. So the world is moving into Buenos Aires, right? So that's why they decided to open the store there. So this is, if you can see my cursor, this is about 1914. Look at this. The blue line is Argentina. The orangish line is Germany, and the gray line is Spain, right? So Argentina is actually richer than Germany. It's richer than France, right? It's twice as rich as Spain at that point of time, right? So that's exactly why Harrods thought that it would be a fantastic idea to start its first store in Buenos Aires. But then what happens? Did it remain that way? Is it still one of the richest countries in the world? No. Look at what has happened. Germany, and this is the post-World War II, right? It really shot up. Spain grew faster, of course, it stalled. Argentina practically did not grow till the end of 90s, and then it grew for a while and again stalled, right? So it barely is now into the high income group, but for all practical purpose, it's like a middle income group country. So that's one of the things that we know for sure, that growth is not guaranteed. You might be one of the richest countries today, but it's no guarantee that 50 years down the line, you will be among the richest countries in the world, right? So growth is definitely not natural. It does not come automatically. It is no way, destined that a country will always grow at a fast rate, right? Let's look at another case. Here's another quiz for you guys. Look at the picture very carefully. Okay? So this image, and let me go back to the image more than this slide, is the border between two countries. Can you guess which are these two countries?
Haiti and Dominican Republic.
Wow, you guys are smart. Or is it Google?
I read about it before, sir.
Good. No, introduce yourself, please. Can you?
Sir, this is Atharv.
Atharv? Excellent, Atharv. Look at this. It couldn't have been more stunning, right? Haiti is, of course, in the news, right? Their president was assassinated by a group of people, foreigners apparently. So it's in news. So everyone has started looking at it, and now the picture that we see, of the border, it's stunning because you see the big difference between the two sides. So one side on the right is the Dominican Republic. On the left is Haiti. And you know what? These two countries are on the same island. It's not even two different places, right? You could argue if they are in Asia and Latin America, South America, or Africa or something. Oh, there are these kind of conditions which are different, climatic or cultural, or variety of other things that can be different. Here we're talking of an island, and just look at even the vegetation. That itself is so different. Nothing else, right, is different here. The same rainfall, same everything, etc. So this is Haiti, and this is República Dominicana, or Dominican Republic, right? And look at it. It wasn't the case at all. In 1950, these two economies were exactly at the same point, right? They had the same income level. They were equally well off or worse off than the rest of the countries. And then what do we see? The Dominican Republic has gone to become a high income country, whereas Haiti has practically remained the same. In fact, its GDP per capita, and this is GDP per capita that I have plotted, is actually lower now than it was in 1950. So their living standards have deteriorated to a certain extent, right? So this is another very stunning example of showing that growth in many ways depend on factors other than just simply natural things, right? So growth has to be nurtured. Growth there has to be a intent, there has to be a policy, there has to be an action for growth. It just does not happen just like that. And that's where the middle income tract comes in. in history of the nations, what we see is that there are very few economies which have actually made into high income countries. There are small countries, even like Dominican Republic, it's a small economy, small country. So right now, if I remember correctly, the World Bank defines countries which has income per capita greater than $12,000 or $14,000, I forget right now, as high income countries, right? So if you leave out the small economies here and there, then it's largely North America, which is, well, even in North America, which is US and Canada. Which is the other North American country, by the way?
Mexico, New Mexico.
Mexico, right? Mexico, people tend to think it's South America or Latin America. I mean, it's Latin America. Latin American is not a geographical thing. It's part of the North American, yeah, right? And therefore, they have the North America Free Trade Agreement, right? NAFTA. Anyway, so that's the thing. It's North America, these two countries, Western Europe, and then, of course, extension of Europe in some senses, Australia and New Zealand, and then few countries in Asia. Japan has been among the pioneer in Asia, of course, and then it's followed by South Korea and some other countries like Hong Kong, if you consider Hong Kong as a different country, right? And that's it. That's the list. So it's very, very, very common for countries to come up to the middle income level and then just fall for that. It's called the middle income trap. Even China is in the middle income, and it's yet to be seen whether it makes it into the high income, right? Remember, all these definitions are in per capita terms because that's what matters. It does not matter how big the economy is because, of course, the population is big, the economy will be big or should be big. If it's not big, then that's a problem, right? So what matters is what is the income per capita. And of course, there's another issue of distribution of the income that will not at all touch upon today. But this middle income trap is real. And the question is, will India fall into that? And if you look at this, again, the same kind of a graph over, this is the Madison project. So look into this data, which is very interesting because Madison was a professor who created this data set. It goes back, he recreated data set that goes back a long, long time. And if you look at it, and then of course, I mean, you have the more modern data anyway, you see that these are the high income countries and there's a gap, and then Argentina, by sheer definition of this, might be now in a high income thing, but look at the gap between, right? And India is far below in a really low state as of now. So that's the big question. Will India be able to jump up, right? And why do we not see countries grow a lot? Why do we see some of the countries fall into this middle income trap? A big one is institutions and governance, right? How are we set up? And it's, you know, in some quarters and somewhere people keep talking about, oh, it's about democracy. Actually not, because if you go back, you look at it, almost all countries are actually democratic countries, right? So it's not about democracy. In fact, if at all, democracy helps. Democracy is something that allows a much, much more inclusive way of doing things and therefore grow at a faster rate, right? If you look at data, and I've done that a few years back, I have a paper on looking at growth rates and volatility of growth rates. If you look at it, there isn't a very clear pattern as to whether democracy matters in high growth or not, particularly over the last 30, 40 years, right? And China, of course, skews things quite a bit. Some of the Asian economies, which are now very vibrant democracies like Indonesia, even South Korea, were not necessarily democracies to begin with, right? So it's not that, but what definitely matters is how inclusive you are in your governance, how you know, in your policy making, how much you focus on human capital, social capital, all of these things, right? And so some of these things matter. Then, of course, one particular thing that really stands up, and if you look at again the history of all of these countries, it's the investment in education, right? You know, we talk about Scandinavian countries and Northern Europe as one of the richest areas in the world today, right? But they were not always that rich, right? They were poor. But even before that, even before when they were rich, they made education, school education compulsory for everyone, and they've invested heavily into their education setup. By the way, in India, school education is still not compulsory. We have a right to education, but right to education has a lot of loopholes. Right to education does not mean it's guaranteed that everyone will study, and particularly in a situation like now in COVID, we are staring at a disaster, right? Even China, by the way, China in 1960s made school education compulsory. So education seems to be a big correlation between what you do in terms of growth rates over the next 50 years. And I'm talking about really long-term growth rates, right? 30, 40, 50 years. And what happens, what happens now in terms of investment in education dictates your next 30, 40, 50 years of growth rate, right? And similarly, investment in other social sectors, including health, it's essentially how you reduce the risk of falling back into poverty, falling back into a lower income group, right? And this COVID in particular has really shown us that without such social safety nets, how easy it can be, right? And today in India in particular, we are really at a really bad shape where people have slid back into poverty. Real hard gain that has happened over the last 20, 30 years has been wiped off completely. Middle income people falling back into lower income groups and so on, right? So that's another correlate with. Another thing that seems to matter is openness and trade, right? How open a country is, and practically all countries throughout the history have taken advantage of openness. There are some countries like Japan, which has had barriers to bring things into the country, so import restrictions and things like that. But that's more of an exception than otherwise. Most of the countries have been very open and they've taken advantage of trade. So Japan also has been a very high exporting country, right? So while import has been low for them, they have been exporting. And this one is kind of endogenous. So the things that I'm talking about are mostly exogenous, right? Can be dealt with by policy, can be dealt with by doing things. Technology and productivity is semi endogenous to a certain extent, because depending on how things are shaped, what you're doing, some of the technology and some of the productivity things shape up, but also what policies we take, put in place, what kind of institutions we have, etc., will shape some of these technologies and productivity. India, by the way, has very low productivity, right? Much lower than US, of course, but it's much lower than China too. And that is something that is a big worry for us, that we have very low productivity, right? So these are some of the things that we really need to think about. And I'm not getting into data or details or models. By the way, when you are going to study an MBA in an MBA program, and one of the things that you will be doing afterwards is probably some bit of forecasting, right? Whatever jobs you do, and it can be informal way of forecasting, or it can be a very formal role for you to do forecasting. And you can't do forecasting unless you foreground yourself in good theory, understand what all of these things are actually doing. In economics, of course, we like to do theory using mathematical models and so on. So those are some of the things that you need to invest in, because if you don't, then you are not really getting the most out of the MBA program, right? So anyway, going back, the big question is, will India make it? Why? Why is this urgency to think about will India make it? Because of the demographic transition we are witnessing, right? And notwithstanding all the debate about population policy and all, we are actually seeing a decrease in the fertility rate, and that's been going on for a while now. And practically all the economies that we know have done well before they have made the switch in their demographic thing, right? So right now, well, I don't have a 2020, but let's look at 2010. We have a huge base of young people, right? And if you look at people above 60 or 65, it's not much. So the dependency is low. So per young person, there is not too many old people that we need to support, right? People, when they retire, when they become old, they're no longer productive in the economy, yet they need to be supported, right? Even if they have their own savings, it's like the total output at that point of time is going to support them, right? So this is the time when we should be growing at a fantastic rate. Look, even by 2030, this flats out. This no longer as, like the pyramid shape is kind of going away, right? And if you look at people above 60, that thing goes up. And by 2050, you would almost have an equal number of people above 60 or so than young people. So then making the transition from middle income to rich is practically, it's very, very challenging, right? So we have at best a 30-year window by which we'll have to make it. We'll have to ensure that we get into a high income group, right? And we really, really have to do that to ensure people have a comfortable life. So now let's look at what's happening in India right now over the last few decades and much, much more recently, right? So let's look at India from 1960 to 2020, right? And I have drawn 3 lines here. The blue line is India. The red line is China. And the green line is the world, right? And this is GDP per capita at constant 2011 prices. So what do we see? One, and this is again going back to the first graph, this is actually stunning that the world income level, world GDP per capita is increasing over time, right? And it's really at a healthy clip. So this means that a lot of people are moving out of poverty. A lot of people are enjoying a lifestyle that the generation before that wouldn't have. See, practically all of you have seen only high growth period in India, right? In this part of the world and this period of the time, we are biased because we have seen a high growth period. So our natural bias is that, oh yeah, growth is natural, growth happens all the time. Because you see that the life that, or the world that your grandparents have seen, your parents have seen, has been substantially different. So change has been palpable, right? So you talk about different kinds of change, it's palpable, but it's not guaranteed, as we have seen, right? So it's this period that we have seen a lot of world economy growing at a really fast rate. And around this period in the 1960s to 1970s, till about 1988 or so, a large part of the growth came from Japan, right? Western Europe. But look at this. China was much poorer than India. China was in 84, China and India was practically at the same time. China opened up, which year did China open up? Any idea? So China was a very closed economy, right? And at that some point, it decided to open up. In the first few years, it allocated some special zones, right, for opening. Go ahead.
So is it around 1700s, the late 1700s, around 1780 or 1790?
No. I'm talking about more recent. China, even at that point of time, was mostly a very closed economy, closed
So
kingdom.
around 78.
1978, right? China has been traditionally a kind of a closed economy, um, even in their different periods of the kingdoms, right? So there were some expeditions. Zhang He is one of the generals who took a really big armada of sheep and reportedly also came to India, went to Middle East and so on. But other than that, they have not been very open, right? But anyway, this we're talking about much more recent history. So 1978 is when they decided to open up. They created some special zones towards the south, Hong Kong and neighborhood, and gradually going up along the coast. So that's the special economic zones, and they decided they will waive off different kinds of conditions, including labor laws, including capital control, and so on and so forth. And those areas were used by other by multinationals and also somewhat domestic companies to produce things those which were exclusively just exported. That's it. They were exported, and then with that experience, they eventually opened up. Right? So 1978. So 1978 they opened up. 1984 they're still 1983, 84 they're still poorer than India. 84 they are same as India, and look how they've taken off. They've simply taken off. India, when we put this graph here, it's grown, right? And this period post 90s, we know that it has grown reasonably well, but it pales in comparison to the Chinese experience. And of course, then this happened, right? So you see, this is the quarterly growth rate. It all seems so minuscule compared to the drop. The drop in the GDP, in the growth rate due to the COVID, right? The recovery is happening, but we'll see how fast or how slow it goes, right? So this is without the COVID. And the thing to see is that COVID, of course, is a shock to the whole system, right? But even before COVID, India's growth was slowing down, and that's ominous because, as we have seen, that India is far below what it can claim to be even reasonably well-to-do country, and we really need to grow at a fast rate. So if you look at 2016 onwards, 2016, by the way, is also coincidentally the demonetization that happens, right? And the economy post 2016 hasn't been doing well. So we are getting into COVID, into that shock already at a growth rate which is less than 5%, right? And then the shock hit us. Now, what's happening? Why was India losing steam, so to say, right? And there are many reasons, and I'm not going to get into that. And as I said, I can probably teach you for a whole semester, maybe a year on that, right? A variety of things. But there's one thing that I'll do. First of all, this is introduce you to the first equation of the talk. It's very rare that you go through a talk in an economics thing by an economist and not see an equation, right? Because that's what helps us to keep things logically consistent and think without worrying about it. And you also need to get a little bit of that training, because without that you will not be able to do a lot of this forecasting, for example, or many of the things that you want to do, even if you're not into economics, right? And jobs related to economics. So what I did was I took a dynamic economy, right? And I wrote down what an ideal economy should be. So that's the standard growth model that we use, right? So there is some growth model that is almost every economist of all stripes, of all kinds and everywhere in the world kind of agrees upon. So we take that. And then we say that suppose there were frictions in the economy And the frictions in the economy is this tau thing, right? Then what happens? And then we get an equation which relates.
Professor, I think you are mute.
Sir, you are on mute.
Oh, sorry, how did that happen? I don't know. So when did you stop hearing me? Before this slide or at this slide?
Just at the top.
Sorry?
So on this slide only when you were talking about friction.
Okay, friction. So I was saying that, one of the things, of course, you learn in your macro class is a growth model. And it's very important that you understand the basics of these kind of models, because these are used to evaluate a lot of things, right? And also for simply your understanding of the economy in general, right? So someday you'll be a CEO, let's say, right? So then you need to understand how the economy will perform, what's going on. So this knowledge is very, very critical for that, right? So, so what I've done is I've taken a standard growth model that practically everyone agrees upon and said, okay, let me introduce certain frictions. And the friction that I've introduced is tau. I'm not getting into details of that friction. And I've got these equations. What does this equation say? This beta is a measure of my patience. It's essentially is my discount rate, right? Discount factor. And then the CT over CT plus 1 is the growth rate, or CT plus 1 over CT is the growth rate of consumption, right? Sigma is a measure of curvature of my utility function. This measures, this among other things, measures my risk aversion, how risk averse I am, right? And the tau I said is the friction, RT is the interest rate in the economy, delta is the depreciation, and K is the capital, right? So I have data on all of these except the tau, because this is something that I have introduced. I have data on beta, I have data on CT and CT plus 1, I have data on RT, I have data on delta, I have data. So I can actually measure this friction in the economy, that what is the friction in the economy. If the economy was frictionless, then I would get this tau to be 0, right? So let's see. Okay, so I built it as an index, right? So you see, this is when we gained into 47, this is 51, we had a very high. There's also a problem of data at that point of time, particularly capital data. So I would not give a lot of credence to that, but we had a high rate of friction, right? But we actually the friction went down. But again, in the 70s, right? 70s was the period, remember, when the nationalization was at full force, banking to mining to everything, right? And the red tapeism, right? All kinds of licensing, etc. So all of that, and the friction in the economy was really high. So it's pushing the brakes of the economy, right? It's literally like that, right? That you want to go fast, you want to drive the car, you have a Maserati, but somehow there are these roadblocks or things like that, which adds a lot of friction. You can't drive fast. You are forced to drive at a very slow pace. And the 90s saw a spate of reforms, and it went down, right? The frictions went down, but it started going up around 2012 or 2013 or so. But it really, post 2014, 15, 16, it's really at a very high state, almost like the 70s, back in the 70s, and it's going up again, right? And that's very, very scary. And that's why a lot of people are talking about next generation of reforms and etc. Right? But this friction, by the way, captures everything in the economy that is stopping the economy. So we don't know what exactly are the elements of this friction. It can be governance, it can be policies, it can be simply like a crisis like this. All kinds of things will be clubbed into this friction. So that is the big worry, that over the last 5-6 years, the friction in the economy has actually gone up. And of course, the short run, now we are the post-COVID thing, it complicates things even more, because what has happened is the COVID has created, and these are all the industries, right? And you see, these are the first 4 quarters after the COVID hit in March 2020. And you see the contractions that's happening. It's huge contraction in the beginning, slightly lower, but it's still in the whole 4 quarters post that. Practically all manufacturing, these are manufacturing only. I don't have data on services, and that's the other problem with India, is we have very little data. So it's an economy-wide impact, which is very, very different from practically anything else. All kinds of crises that we can think of: the 2007-8 crisis, the 97 Asian financial crisis, the Greek crisis, the 1991 India crisis, etc. Right? So they are often limited, or at least start with a certain number of sectors, right? Be it housing, financial sector, etc., etc. But this is very different because it impacts practically all aspects of the economy. And another part of it is that the demand is very low, whereas that is something that we're going to come back to in a minute, but it's a very, very big worry. Recovery is uneven, high unemployment, high liquidity. So one of the things that the government has done is it has increased liquidity in the economy. And practically all governments have done that, but in India too, that's what the chosen policy response has been. So liquidity is very high, but there's no uptick of that liquidity. Credit has not gone up, right? So, and another really worrisome thing is that we are seeing wipeouts of MSMEs. And that is worrisome because MSMEs employ a really large number of people in India. And second, it reduces competition, and competition is a must for all kinds of things in the economy, from innovation to growth, right? So without that, and then we will, right now, it's the tip of it, but we'll probably see a lot of bad loans of a very different kind, right? It's not the kind that very big businesses have taken loan and not given back, but we'll see bad loans of many small accounts not being able to pay up. And then very, very recently, there's now a new headwind, which is the inflation, right? And this is the blue line is the call money bank or interbank rate in India, right? And the red line is the CPI, and it's the percentage change, right? And as you see, we have had really high periods of growth. That's one period where there's deflation, and this is the period, again, 2010 to in our recent memory, where we have had 10-11% growth, inflation, right? The green line is when Raghuram Rajan became the governor, and this purple line is when we officially adopted inflation targeting. And some other day, again, we can talk about monetary policy. It's very interesting how things matter, particularly reputation and things like that. I'll come to that in a minute, though. But then we really entered a low inflation zone. But now it's inching back, right? Right now, officially, the RBI is mandated to have inflation within the band, right? 4% plus minus 2%. And we are above that. Current inflation rate is 6.3%. And inflation is not only rising in India, but it's rising globally. This is US. And by the way, I plotted this because I will not have time today, but it will be very interesting and instructive to think about 1970s in US. It kind of saw a similar situation as in India, right? Was very high inflation and very low growth. In India, again, we are fearing that it might happen like that. But here, this yellowish zone here is the new and very recent period, and you see the inflation shooting up in US and going above 5% for the first time in a really long time, right? And so these will have implications for India too. But here's the challenge, because some of the things that we need to do to control inflation, and by the way, there are many monetary, inflation is always a monetary phenomenon, right? So monetary policy is the one that we need to use to tame down inflation. And there are different things like repo rate you'll come across, or CRR or SLR, and those are the things that the RBI or the central bank uses. But at the core of monetary policy making is this: the credibility, the reputation, the communication. And if you look at the literature in monetary policy, you'll see a lot of work on that. That how do we build credibility? How do we build reputation? And therefore, and also how well we communicate, right? For example, today, if Powell or the ECB chairperson just says that, oh, we expect the inflation to go up, it will have a catastrophic effect on things, right? They have to communicate well. This is a very, very critical thing. But for India, the big challenge is that what do? Do you go for taming the inflation, and therefore you probably need to increase the interest rate, which might have an impact on the growth rate, right? So it's a growth versus inflation challenge that will show up in the coming quarters. And this is something that we need to keep an eye on, right? So monetary policy will have very limited scope because, as I already said, reputations and therefore expectations play a crucial role in determining the inflation and in the transmission of monetary policy to the macroeconomy. So there will be very little scope in the monetary policy aspect. So far, they have been very patient. They have just said, OK, let's wait and watch. Let's not change the interest rate. But if period after quarter, the inflation rate is above the 6%, which is the band, then either the central government will have to change the band, and that will erode all kinds of reputation, any reputation that the central bank has. Central bank has already eroded. Their reputation has gone down over the last 2-3 years since the resignation of the last governor. And that can actually spiral inflation even more. So we'll have to be very, very careful. So we need to ensure that people know that central bank is independent, and it is thinking independent of the political pressures, right? And it has to have a commitment to a strong nominal anchor. The strong nominal anchor is here, the inflation being 4%, or 4% plus minus 2%, but essentially around 4%, right? So the central bank has very, very, very little room to play with that. So therefore, a large part of the focus in this few quarters will go back to the finance ministry, and we'll have to see what they do in terms of fiscal policy, in terms of managing inflation. In India, inflation, food inflation, there's a lot of non-monetary policy, like how much you procure, what rate you give, what kind of things, other incentives that you give to the different groups, all of that, right? So we will have to look at this space very, very carefully. So I said I'll keep some time, but I've taken a lot of time, so I'll finish this with this last slide. So the big question, so will India make it? And really, it's hanging by a thread. The future is in balance, right? We are at a very, very critical stage. So here, yeah, so the green line is the threshold for becoming high income according to World Bank, right? So this is, as I said, yeah, it looks like it's $12,000 US. And this is where we are. Now, I have plotted 4 different scenarios that suppose we grew at 10%, average growth rate over from the next 30 years is 10%, right? Or 8%, 6%, and 4%. So if you see, if we did grow at 10% for the next 20 years or so, we will cross that threshold. No country has ever done that, right? No country in the history of humanity has ever done that. Not Japan, not China, not Germany, not US, not UK, no one. So does it mean it cannot be done? Well, there's always a first. We'll see. But it's very unlikely event, right? 8%. So if we grew at 8%, then around 44 or 45, so 20, 25 years, we'll have to grow above 8%. Well, that's like China to a certain extent. And that's something that we'll have to do then, right? I mean, even China probably did not have 20, 30 years of above 8% growth, right? At 8% to 6%, that was the range. So the next scenario is probably the most likely scenario, that if we grow at an average of 6% for the next 30 years, and again, this is something that no country probably has done, that 30 years of consistent 6% growth, right? Japan has done it about 5% or so. 6% is for 30 years. I'm not talking about 1, 2, 3, 4 years, right? 30 years, you have to grow at above 6%. And that is the minimum it will take for us to reach that level. And I'm not even considering whether that green line shifts up or not, right? Forget that. I mean, today's high income level, that's all that I'm looking at. And if we slip, if we have anything less than 6% for the next 30 years, let's say 4% or so, we would be stuck at the middle income level. So that middle income trap will basically hold us, right? And so that's why it's we are at a very critical juncture right now, and we will see how things shape up. And some other day we can talk about a lot about all of these things that I've talked about, right? But today, let me stop at this.